Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Martin Lang. He is an assistant professor at Masaryk University, investigating the evolution of ritual behavior and the relationship between anxiety and rituals. And today we're going to talk about that. So, Dr. Lang, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hello, Ricardo, and thank you for your kind invitation, and hello to everyone who may listen to us.
Great. So let's start perhaps with some aspects associated with ritual. So one of them, and I think I've already touched on it a few times on the show, but since you studied specifically, let's start with synchrony. So what is it and how is it achieved specifically in the rituals?
All right. So for me, the definition of synchrony would be that it's a matching of movements or postures or verbalizations in time between multiple people. So, in other words, it's when basically people perform the same exact behaviors at the same times. Typically we can think of synchronous movement as dancing or singing or chanting or armies marching. All these behaviors have the same common link, which is people do the same thing at the same time. And these behaviors, like synchrony, doesn't need to be specific for rituals, but it often occurs in rituals. And most often during rituals, these behaviors would be like chanting together or praying together. In Christian mass, you can think about people standing up and kneeling at the same time. Or during a Muslim prayer, you can think about prostrations, like hundreds of people doing the same prostration at the same time. And by doing the same movement and observing that the others are doing also the same thing, this is what I would call a synchrony. And this is what is then supposed to have specific effects on people doing these movements.
Mm-hmm. And what are those psychological effects that synchrony has?
Right. So there is a couple of them. I think the one that was studied the most and is usually the most widely discussed is the effect of synchrony on various prosocial outcomes. So typically, just to give you an example, the research on synchrony looks like this: that a group of anonymous people who didn't know each other before come to lab, and they are asked to do some either synchronous movement, so like hand movement or some verbalizations together, and then they are compared with another group of participants who do this movement in asynchrony or don't do any activity. And what is measured afterwards is, for example, how people like each other, how they trust each other, or how they cooperate in economic games. And what we generally find in these studies is that people who synchronize, they like each other more and they trust each other more compared to the other control groups. So synchrony seemed to really advance these prosocial outcomes.
And that also happens outside the context of rituals, right? I mean, people go
Yes.
through a particular ritual, they get synchronized, let's say, and then that prosociality goes beyond that, goes from to outside the rituals, right?
So this is a very interesting and important question, but sadly, we don't have much empirical evidence.
Okay.
So it has been assumed, but and I will give you a bit longer answer to that. Just it definitely makes sense logically, because we can think often about synchrony, and that's one thing I didn't mention, is that synchrony is very natural. So it's natural for us to do the things or our behaviors in the same time with others. One classical example is clapping. Like when a crowd of people clap, they tend to synchronize naturally, or when people rock in chairs and so on. So synchronization is actually quite easy for us. And usually during the studies that I talked about, it's getting people into asynchrony, which is the difficult part. And that has some methodological consequences, but I think that's too nuanced for now. But back to your question. So given that synchrony is quite natural, we may think about synchronizing people during ritual as some sort of quite easy collective action. It's a thing that everyone can do, and it's pretty easy, it's pretty natural, and it may have the effect that we feel like we did something together, we cooperated, we performed this ritual together, and this can be a basis for our next cooperation. So then, outside of the ritual context, let's say we go for hunt, or we go to build a bridge, or any sort of collective action, this recall of synchrony of the action that we did together may help us to extend the trust to others and extend the cooperation with others also to different contexts. So it definitely makes sense, and if I should bet, I would say it's true. But at least to my knowledge, all of the synchrony experiments were usually, like you do the manipulation in the lab and then you do the measurement. It would be really interesting to see how long-lasting this effect is, and I don't know if anyone has done that.
By the way, I think we haven't touched specifically on the how all of this translates neurophysiologically. So, are there
Hmm. Hmm.
specific markers of the synchrony
Hmm.
that we see
Hmm.
neurophysiologically?
Hmm. Yeah, so this is also interesting question, one that has received quite a lot of attention. And in my reading, I would say that there are broadly two mechanisms that were suggested. One mechanism is related to the so-called mirror neuron system, or some call it the action observation network, which is basically a structure in the human brain which is activated when we observe someone else's movement. Now, this structure basically maps others' movements or others' behaviors onto our own motor networks, such that we could intuit or guess the other people's intentions. So given that we map their behaviors onto our own motor network, we may infer what would be probably our intentions during this movement and then project it onto others. So this is very shortly the function of this network. Now, how this works in synchrony? Well, you see, so in synchrony, we observe others behaving, so it maps onto our motor cortex, but we also behave, we also perform the same behavior. So what is happening, and some people suggested this, is that the effect is that there is some kind of blurring between ourselves and the others performing the same movement. So we feel closer to them, or we feel more similar to them. And this is the basis for the prosocial outcomes of synchrony. So because we feel closer, we tend to like each other more, and so on. Now, the other mechanism that has been suggested is related to the hormonal underpinnings of social bonding generally in primates, and that's namely the neuropeptide endorphin. So endorphins are generally endogenous neuropeptides that are activated during pain or when we feel pain. So it's like a protection against pain. But there has been also quite a lot of research into the social aspects of endorphins, and this has been mostly done by a group of researchers around Robin Dunbar, who showed that this endorphin activation is associated with social bonding. So when comparing these two mechanisms directly in our own research, we found that synchronous movement compared to asynchrony and control conditions, as I said before, synchronous movement really activates both of these mechanisms. So we do see that people who were in synchrony, they report that they feel closer to each other. They feel more like their identities are overlapping. And also we do see increased endorphin response in the synchronous participants. But the crucial question is then whether these mechanisms mediate the actual prosocial outcomes. And what we saw in our research is that both mechanisms mediated reported liking of other participants who synchronized, but cooperation, as measured through an economic game, through the trust game, there the effect was mediated only through the endorphin response. So basically, synchrony increased the endorphin levels more than the other conditions. And through this increase, people then were able to trust each other more and cooperate more in the economic gain. So I think from this we can conclude, and it's a pretty preliminary conclusion, but I think it's very interesting that these effects are really quite, the effects of synchrony are really quite low level, and based on these hormones, which is something that makes sense evolutionarily, but may be quite surprising to many of us.
Mhm. And what are the specific aspects of rituals that facilitate group coordination?
Right. So I guess one thing we can talk about here is how can people how to say, how can not recognize each other, but how can people recognize who the intentions of others, right? This is probably what I wanted to say, because before we talked about synchrony and the effects of prosociality. Now, maybe what I should mention here is also what we mean by prosociality, because this has been a very general term that has been used, and it's kind of like umbrella term for various behaviors promoting others' welfare. So for me, this is prosociality doesn't necessarily mean that it's just altruism or just helping. It's really umbrella term also for things like mutual cooperation and so on. Now, what I think is that if we talk about rituals and prosociality and coordination, that rituals may promote prosocial outcomes in two ways. One way would be what we just talked about, which is the social bonding pathway. So, by engaging together in a ritual, for example, in some synchronous ritual with others, we feel bonded, we like each other more, and then we cooperate. Now, the other pathway, which I would call a signaling pathway, is more related to coordination. So I'm getting back to your question. And the coordination here is specifically meant by coordinating people who have the same intentions and same interests. Why is this important? So if you talk about prosociality and prosocial behaviors, of course we need to mention the risk of free riding. So when we want to help others or cooperate with others, we often want them to also help us, or so in other words, we expect some kind of reciprocity from others. We don't want to just help others and then not being helped, or invest into some kind of collective action and then just see that others didn't invest anything and just reap the benefits of our collective action, which is something that has been generally described as free riding. So the question here is how people can coordinate with the same intentions, with the same prosocial intentions, and exclude free riders from their collective actions. And so this is like generally, and I will come back to rituals, but a short sideway. This is generally like a problem of reliable communication that has been long recognized in animal studies, and within species or also between species communication. So the question is, if you have some kind of hidden traits, something that is unobservable, how can we communicate this to others, and how can we communicate this reliably so the others know that they can trust this communication? And one suggested solution to this are so-called costly signals. These signals are used to communicate some hidden quality, as I said. Typically in animal realm, that would be genetic fitness. And the reliability of this communication here is facilitated by attaching a specific cost to this signal, such that the individuals that do not have this quality or have like low quality cannot afford this cost. My favorite example here are the tail streamers of barn swallows. So they are pretty long, it's like this fork. And interestingly, the longer they are, the harder is to fly with them. So again, only individuals who are genetically fit, broadly, can afford to have these long tails because it actually impedes their flying ability. And what we saw, or what has been shown, is that these individuals with longer streamers are also preferred as mating partners. So basically, what we see here is that the genetic quality is indexed by this costly signal, which is the long tails, but it's also read by the receivers who see, okay, this guy has a really long tail. It means that it's costly for him, but he still can fly very well, so he must be really fit. So I'm going to choose them. And similarly, in costly signaling, the canonical example would be the train of the peacock. Again, it's something like very elaborate, huge, that is really costly, but again, only the fit individuals can afford this. Now, finally, going back to rituals. If you would translate this question to rituals, it has been suggested that the ritual participation, and especially participation in what we call extreme rituals, that often involve self-harm. So it may be things like self-flagellation, or piercing the body with sometimes hundreds of piercing, or walking on the bed of hot coals. So all these activities, which are kind of perplexing and puzzling from the evolutionary point of view, like why do people do them? It has been suggested that they serve exactly this purpose. It's the costly communication of some hidden quality. And the hidden quality here in this case would be commitment to the group, to the values and to the norms of the specific group that mandates this ritual. And only individuals who are committed to the group would be willing to undergo these strenuous rituals. So just to give you an example, in our laboratory, we often do field work in Mauritius, and we work with a Hindu community which performs a ritual that is called the Taipusam Kavadi, where people exactly pierce their bodies with hundreds of needles and walk on hot asphalt, and then they have to climb hundreds of steps to the temple and so on. And so people who do this, I can infer just by looking at them that they must be really dedicated, to their faith, to their belief in their gods and in the community. Because me as an outsider, I wouldn't be willing to undergo this ritual. I wouldn't be willing to suffer that much because I'm not committed to that group. So, in this respect, rituals has been, or the participation in ritual has been often explained in these terms of costly signals of commitment to the group, especially in these extreme cases. And to give you one more example, maybe, or one example from our research. So what we can infer from this is that rituals, or this signaling ritual, is kind of like signaling platform or communication platform that allow to assort or coordinate people who have the same intentions, and then they can cooperate together without these free riders. And this is also, this doesn't need to be only again related just to religious rituals. We can again think about the initiation rituals in army or in violent gangs, so these are again like more broad mechanisms that we observe also in religions, but also in secular communities.
There's also another very interesting phenomenon associated with rituals, that is identity fusion. So what is it, and in what conditions does it occur?
Right, so this is a bit related to what I just talked about. So identity fusion has been described as sort of visceral feeling of oneness with a group. But there is one important qualification to this, which is that it doesn't mean that the personal identity would be blurred with the group identity. So identity fusion really refers to some kind of functional equivalence between the personal identity and the group identity, such that by activating the personal identity, we see that it has the same effect of activating the group identity. Mm-hmm. And what has been shown in previous research, that participants fused with their groups are often willing to sacrifice for their group, or at least report their willingness to sacrifice for their group. So for example, typically this research would use infamous trolley dilemma, where you would ask people, would you be willing to sacrifice your own life in this trolley dilemma, to save members of your group? And people who would be highly fused with their own group would often report willingness to self-sacrifice. But recently similar effects have been also shown in real world groups like the ISIS fighters. So it seems that identity fusion is a pretty strong psychological predictor of these self-sacrificial behaviors.
And it also has some sort of relationship with the willingness to sacrifice oneself, right?
Yes, exactly. And the question here, maybe the interesting question that relates to what I said before, is when or how is this fusion created? Because if we say that it's really important factor in predicting self-sacrificial behavior, we need to ask, like, but how does it emerge? And here we can again think about rituals, and this has been research mostly promoted by Harvey Whitehouse, who proposed that identity fusion originates via this shared dysphoric experiences. So so this is like having lived through some terrible events together with other people, and like the specific example here may be soldiers fighting in a foxhole, or these extreme cases, or being part of some, let's say, like or being a victim of terrorist attack.
Yeah.
But also interestingly, for our discussion, for our current topic, is that Harvey Whitehouse suggests that these extreme rituals have a similar function. So because they are often these like include not only suffering but also high pageantry, and they are very elaborate and they are very memorable, and all this serve to build this fusion with this specific religious group or secular group that would have these extreme rituals, which should then translate into this willingness to sacrifice oneself for others. And just one more qualification here. So identity fusion is often really focused on this like extreme self-sacrifice, but I think it has been shown, and part of our one study of ours also showed that it doesn't need to be necessarily only this like extreme self-sacrificial behavior, but it even the fusion can be scalable to some extent. So even like things like contributing to the contributing money to the common pool, or taking part in collective action at some personal cost, may be also predicted by identity fusion.
Another question: do rituals help people to internalize social norms?
Right. So this is important question, and a question that has been pondered by many scholars by now in anthropology and religious studies. But to answer it, I feel like we first need to talk a bit more about what we mean by ritual.
Okay.
And why should they internalize norms. So for me, and here I mostly rely on the work of Roy Rappaport and others, who define ritual as structured performance that is often imbued with important meaning. Now, the performative part is crucial here, because ritual is something that people must do to keep their social world alive. That they must perform in front of others, and also, if you think about in front of themselves, to again and again confirm the existence of a particular social world. So if I give you just one example, like Roman religious system, like we know quite a lot about it. We know what people believed, but no one believes it today because no one practices it. No one, performs the ritual. If we would again have, the ritual performance, as in some like neo-pagan movements, for example, in Europe, this is what brings energy back, to the beliefs and to the social world. So ritual here is really important because it's an action, it's a performance. Now, the performance, as I said, needs to be structured such that people would understand each other. Because the problem, or it's not a problem, but it's a characteristic of ritual, is that these rituals are often opaque. So if I go back to my previous example in Mauritius, when we observe these rituals, like we often had no clue what is going on or why people do what they do. So for us, like they are functionally opaque, and there's usually no clear functional link between the performance itself and the desired outcome. So in this respect, it cannot be that everyone is doing their own ritual, because we wouldn't understand why the other people are doing what they are doing. The ritual needs to be structured such that we would understand each other. And this structure, need to be consistent in time. So that's why we say that rituals are often rigid, meaning, that they are performed the same in the same form again and again, sometimes for centuries. Mm-hmm. And importantly, and I'm gonna get finally to your question, is that rituals are also imbued with meaning and are like really significant for participants. And this meaning is often connected to the to the belief system, to the social world, to the existence of the social world. And the social world, importantly, usually have some norms, have some values. And during rituals, these values are often explicitly mentioned, or at least people commit to these values by participating in rituals. So just to give you an example, like in a Christian mass, participants recite particular behavioral norms they commit to, and also behaviors that they condemn, or they say that they will not do. Mm-hmm. And just by doing this, by just saying these prayers that include these behavioral norms, we keep these norms alive, basically, for us and for others. Now, why should ritual help internalize norms? Exactly because ritual is repetitive. It occurs frequently in predetermined time, and it's rigid. So it has the same structure that includes these norms. So we recite, again, going back to Christian mass, we recite these norms every Sunday or every day during evening prayer, again and again, helping us to internalize these norms such that we don't even need to think about how we should behave in specific situations. It's just automatic. It's just internalized.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into anxiety, just one last question about synchrony and rituals in general. So at the beginning, when I asked you about synchrony, you mentioned as an example music. So does religious music have any specific effects?
The direct answer to your question is I don't know, but I guess I know you are asking here about our research on like religious music and using it as a sort of stimulus for checking norm compliance. So what we did in this research is we thought, given that what I just explained about the internalization of norms during rituals, we thought that if rituals really work through this associative learning, so we again repeat the same norms again and again, then if we would take one aspect of ritual or one factor that is present there and present it to people outside of the ritual context, would it prime there, or would it nudge them to actually behave according to these norms? Mm-hmm. And what we did is that we chose religious music that is often part of these rituals. And it would be usually just a music, so no words, because then it would be pretty obvious that, if we say people how they should behave, that, they might behave like that. And so just to test this, we really took just the music, and we played this music to participants with various, control conditions for the tempo of the music and styles of the music and so on. And well, we played them these different songs during some kind of like cheating dilemmas. So we would give people a possibility to cheat for money in our experimental task. It would be anonymous, so they could just earn more by cheating. And we wanted to see if just by playing this religious music in the background, we could nudge people to basically keep it the norm, so that is cheat less. And we did this across several nations, and generally we did observe this effect for religious participants, which makes sense. If you really think about, it's an associative mechanism. So people who are not part of religious traditions, they do not have this association between the specific music and the specific ritual. So it cannot basically activate these norms during these cheating dilemmas. But we did see this in some countries in religious participants. So in this respect, this is like a bit more subtle support for the thesis that rituals indeed help to internalize norms.
What is anxiety then, and where does it stem from?
Right. So maybe I just contextualize this question a bit more, because what we talked so far about are kind of like the social or prosocial effects or social aspects of ritual. And this is really an important, and I would say like the major topic in the study of ritual, at least from the evolutionary and cognitive perspective. However, there is also an important research line, and this has been recognized for a long time now in anthropology, that there is a connection between ritual performance and anxiety. So I guess we will get into why there should be this connection, but to answer to your question first then, is what is anxiety? So for me, anxiety is kind of adaptive mechanism that motivates us to avoid potential threats. Now, the word potential here is crucial because when we face some imminent threat, for example, a predator attacking us, our brains and bodies react with a fight-flight response. So that's something a bit different. Anxiety is really more about the uncertainty of a threat, whether the threat will occur and what is going to be the magnitude of the threat. So to give you one example, imagine walking down some kind of shabby alley at night, and this is what should provoke anxiety, because you don't know what type of threats may be there, may await you in this alley, and you are unsure about these threats. So this is really, this is about the prospect of potential danger, and we don't really know whether it's going to occur or not. But just one qualification, these threats, of course, doesn't need to only be related to our lives or to our safety. It may be generally threats to our well-being, to our resources, and to our social status. So one example may be that in psychological studies, anxiety is often manipulated using a so-called public speaking paradigm, where participants have to give a speech about an unfamiliar topic in front of a group of experts. So in this respect, this is really like a threat to participants' social status, because they need to perform in front of like a knowledgeable audience. So and similarly, this doesn't need to be. Maybe this is what I should have said in the beginning. When we talk about anxiety, we really talk about mechanism that is pretty prevalent across non-human animals and humans as well. So this social status anxiety, there has been a lot of primate studies showing this. So it's an interesting topic, but that's off topic right now. So this is for me anxiety in short.
And does ritualized behavior help reduce and control anxiety? And if so, how?
So this is something, when I said that, the question of ritual and anxiety has been here for a long time, We may go back here to Bronislaw Malinowski, one of the famous anthropologists from the beginning of the first half of the 20th century, who originally proposed that rituals often occur in these times of stress or anxiety or uncertainty. And he claimed that rituals are response to these events. And then in turn, these rituals occur because they help to manage anxiety. So if you think about it, basically this claim or this hypothesis has two parts. The first is that when we are anxious, we should be performing rituals, and by performing rituals, and that is the second part, we should get calmer. So if you would like to we did wanted to explore this two-part hypothesis in our studies. And so what we did in our first study is that we wanted to see whether really ritual would be a spontaneous response to these anxiogenic situations. And we used this public speaking paradigm that I talked about before. And we used it in one group of participants, and we had some control action in other group. And then we asked people to clean an object, and we measured the structure of their hand movements. And we were looking for these typical aspects of rituals that I explained before, which would be things like rigidity and repetitiveness. So basically doing the same types of movements in a rigid pattern, in a specific structured pattern. Yeah. And indeed, we saw that participants who were awaiting the public speaking part, so were anxious, would perform movements that would more closely resemble a ritual. And then in a study that will hopefully be out soon, we explored the second part of Malinowski hypothesis. So we took these ritual movements, or the let's say the characteristic of these ritual movements that we observed in the first study, and now we invited participants into our lab, and now we made all of them anxious and randomly assigned them to either perform these ritual type of movements or some control movements. And there we saw that, in participants who were really highly anxious, this ritual performance helped them, helped them to decrease or to reduce anxiety faster than in the other control groups. So this is like a preliminary support for this thesis. However, and I need to mention this, is that in these lab studies, we looked really at like a very low-level aspects or characteristics of what we call ritual in general. And so there is also one other study that we conducted in Mauritius, where we looked at performance of like naturally occurring rituals. So rituals that people are used to do, and so that those would be prayers in a temple, for example. And there we could see stronger effects. So these rituals that are habituated and that are learned have stronger effects on reducing anxiety. So I think in general, we can conclude that it seems like rituals indeed help to manage anxiety, that they occur in this context and they help to reduce anxiety. But the mechanisms are not that clear yet, or there is probably like a complex of mechanisms that still need to be investigated. And because I think we are even though the question has been posed really long time ago, we are still at the beginning of really understanding what is going on here.
About this relationship between ritualized behavior and controlling anxiety, isn't there something similar happening with people who suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder?
Yeah, excellent question. So when I talked about the mechanism that we try to investigate, this mechanism or these aspects of ritual, they are usually coined under the term ritualized behavior. And this is important because it again means that we don't need to look solely at religious rituals. These are the basically type of behaviors that we can often observe in everyday life, in secular context. And they are characterized by this increased repetitiveness. So we do the same thing at the same structured type of behavioral pattern. And it may be just washing dishes, it may be ordering our room, and so on. So this is everything that I would call ritualization of like everyday activities. And these also may be triggered by anxiety. So in the first study that I talked about, we had people clean an object. Now, you are right with pointing here to some psychophysiological disorders, pardon me, some psychopathological disorders, because it has been really suggested that this ritualization is characteristic for some of them, and the most notably the obsessive compulsive disorder, where this ritualization is usually quite pathological. So what it means is that it's extremely excessive, and you can think of some famous examples from movies, like people coming home from outside and needing or feeling the compulsion to wash their hands hundreds of times, for 1 hour, for example, or when they eat, the food needs to be structured in a very particular way such that they would feel safe to eat, and so on. There are many facets of this disorder, but they all have in common, the sense of compulsion to have control over what is going on in their lives. And based on these insights and insights also from some anthropological observations, we hypothesized in our research, and that was the motivation for investigating this factor, is that the important aspect of anxiety is the fact that we do not know whether the threat will occur, but also we do not have any control over it. I give you another example. Imagine that your close family is flying in a plane somewhere far away, and now you start to feel anxious that something may have happened to them. What can you do? Nothing. But you are still anxious, right? Because you have no control over what's going on. And this is going back to Malinowski. This is what Malinowski proposes, that this is exactly the function of ritual, which may like artificially seem unrelated to the threat, or you don't know how it should affect the threat, but you still feel like the compulsion to do at least something. And this is when the ritual comes in. And the fact that the ritual is structured and well predictable may help you to give a sense of that you have now control over the situation, because you know what is going to happen. That is the ritual. It happens in the exact prescribed way, and this may give you the feeling of control over the situation, even though this control is kind of artificial, because the actual control, like over the weather or over the storm or sun and rain and things like that, you cannot get it, even though the results affect you very much. So so in this respect, the aspect of control in anxiety and in rituals is crucial here, and this is also where I would draw the parallels to these psychopathological disorders.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the psychological well-being effects that rituals have, we've already talked about several different mechanisms through which that can happen. But what about extreme ritual practices? Because it doesn't seem so clear why they would potentially also have those effects, because they seem very stressful and anxiety inducing. So how that happens there?
So this is an excellent question, and I think it can be tackled multiple ways. The first answer is that when you think about rituals and why people perform rituals, we of course think about what functions ritual have. And the important conclusion here is that of course rituals can have multiple functions. So when you think about extreme rituals, I talked about this in the context of costly signals and reliable communication and social bonding. So in this aspect, we do not necessarily need to connect, or the stressfulness or the stressfulness part of this ritual and the anxiogenic part of this ritual may have a different function, right? It's a function of when I go through this stress, I feel more bonded, to the other ritual participants. So this is one answer. However, we did study also the potential effects of these extreme rituals on perceived well-being and health, because from ethnographic interviews, it appeared that many ritual participants perform these rituals exactly when they feel ill or when they feel, they are sick or have some illness, and which is often, difficult to treat by conventional methods. And this led us to ponder whether participating in these extreme rituals may actually have some positive effects also on health and well-being. And so what we did is that we measured participants' self-reported health and well-being during, and I think it was 6 weeks altogether. And this was again in Mauritius, in the Hindu community, who performed the ritual Thaipusam Kavadi that I already talked about. And we measured, their self-perceived health and also physiological health before the ritual, 1 week, during the ritual, and after the ritual. And while we haven't seen any, effects of ritual on the physiological measures, we did see increase in well-being and self-perceived health in ritual participants after performing this extreme ritual. So it may seem that here this ritual behavior may act as a form of placebo, because the ritual is dedicated, to a powerful god, to a powerful supernatural agent. And you can think about it. That these agents may also not only demand some type of normative behavior from you, but may also grant you, some benefits, like, for example, treating you from illness. And so by participating in this ritual, maybe, there may be some kind of placebo effect that, you did something and then you should deserve this reward from this powerful supernatural agent. So that's one potential explanation. And of course, the other obvious explanation may be the whole social setting of this ritual. And this again goes back to the social bonding question, which is when people participate in these rituals, the whole community usually can see them, and they gain prestige, they gain status, and people come, they bring presents, they come to visit, and all this may also really improve well-being. And in case of some illness or some kind of disease, it may also help get important resources from other people. So overall, it seems like through this pathway, there may be also some beneficial effects of participation in these extreme rituals.
Changing topics, I would like to ask you now about moralizing gods and the potential relationship between religiosity and prosociality. Starting with moralizing gods, so how did they evolve culturally?
So this actually connects to what I just talked about, which are these powerful supernatural agents. And what we mean specifically by the term moralizing gods is that those are gods or supernatural agents who are concerned with human behavior. And not only that they are concerned, but they are usually quite powerful, so they can observe human behavior, and they can also punish misbehavior. So these are like the three important characteristics of these moralizing gods. So when I said before, when talking about extreme rituals, that people may get benefits from these powerful gods, indeed they are powerful, but they are powerful also because they not only know everything, but they can also punish us, either here in our current lives or in the afterlife. Now, how did they evolve? So there is quite a lot of debate right now about when they may have evolved, but I will just keep closer to the line of thought that I worked with, which is connected to people like Aaron Lorenzayan and Joseph Henrich, who proposed that these powerful moralizing gods evolved as an adaptive response to human societies growing larger. This would be basically at the beginning of the Holocene, where you would get people starting to farm, they would start to settle, build these larger communities, and the problem with getting larger communities is that you start to interact with anonymous people, with people you don't know about their reputation, you don't know them, and you may get more into these one-shot interactions. Where if you think about what I talked before with this free riding problem, this is really getting very actual in this context, because if I know that I will not see you again tomorrow, I may just rip you off during some economic transaction and so on. So these other mechanisms that help to facilitate cooperation, like rituals, for example, would be insufficient here. And the theory proposes that people already, of course, believed in some sort of gods or spirits or ancestors, but they usually wouldn't be that much powerful. But the adaptive pressure here through these large-scale societies, or living in these large-scale societies, would be on transforming these beliefs into agents or deities that have these abilities to observe others' behavior, right? So because I know that you believe in the same moralizing God as I do, we both know that this God is observing us and observing how we treat each other, and if we would mistreat each other, the God would punish us. So this is like, in a nutshell, the idea that these moralizing gods really are a response to this growing society and more, transactions that are more anonymous. And important qualification here is that this is in the time where we do not have secular institutions, like the police, like the juridical system and so on, that we rely on quite a lot in contemporary societies.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship between religiosity and prosociality? Because as far as I know, it's a bit complicated. Is it that religiosity really promotes prosociality?
Yeah, so this, I think what we get here is why this question is complicated is because we have two terms that are, notoriously vague and hard to define. I already talked about prosociality and try to, set some boundaries of what I mean by that. But, the same can be said about religiosity. And I guess one problem that we do see with religiosity, and now to be honest, I'm not sure how we can generalize beyond Western Christian population with this problem. So let's just please focus on this population right now. But what we do see is that, if you think back what I said about rituals, how rituals internalize norms and how you repeat these norms again and again, there is a lot of pressure on appearing, even in front of yourself, as keeping these norms, right? It's really important to do that. And so when you ask people, like, are you pro-social, or, do you help others? Do you cheat others? Of course, they say, I do help, I do not cheat, and so on, because it's just, even, it's their own self-reflections of themselves. And it's also a desirable response, in this context of, let's say, Western Christianity. But then when we look at the actual behavioral evidence, sometimes it is supportive, sometimes not really, and we do not see that much of a difference between, let's say, Christians and non-believers or believers of different faiths. So I guess the relationship is definitely complicated, but also, that we do not have enough data, and that would be, both behavioral data and self-reported data from other religions to make a more cross-culturally valid qualification of this relationship.
Mm-hmm. So one last question then. In your work, you talk about what you call a complex adaptive
Mm.
systems approach to the study of religion, which combines evolutionary, cognitive, and contextual approaches to religion. Could you tell us about it?
Yeah, so maybe some background first.
Okay.
Why is this approach important for me specifically is that my history is in religious studies. And when I studied like the typical approaches in the religious studies is through humanities, and these are very valuable, but they do not usually allow you to ask these big questions, like why, what's the function of rituals, why people take part in these extreme rituals, and so on. And then throughout my career, I also worked at anthropological departments and human evolutionary biology departments, where I could look at these big questions from the other side, and try to propose some mechanisms and some like ultimate explanations of these behaviors. However, I still felt like these two perspectives are really disconnected, and they shouldn't be, because eventually we study the same phenomenon. And so I was really, like, for a long time desperate for some kind of integrative framework, or overarching framework that could help us, to bring what we study at like a local, some local events or some local historical specific events, and connect it to some broader explanations, which wouldn't ignore these, local specificities. And the systemic approach is one way to do this. And this is really an approach that comes again from evolutionary biology, and from the study of systems that don't need to be necessarily organic. But the main idea here is that across the world, these various religious traditions, they have some common elements or common building blocks to them. And usually we would, study these building blocks separately, like synchrony, for example, or extreme rituals, and so on and so on. But as a matter of fact, they all relate to each other. And this approach gives you the tools to start exploring how these building blocks relate to each other, through some feedback loops or through some nonlinear relationships, to produce what we saw on like the local scale. So instead of saying religion does this across the world, which is vague and really not sensical claim to say, you can start to focus more on saying this specific religious system in this location and in this time functions like this. It has these basic building blocks, and these building blocks are given by some kind of history of the system in this specific environments. And of course, these systems will have similarities across similar environments and similar ecological and social pressures, and that's fine to say that. But it also allows you to say, I want to focus just on this one specific system, and this system is specific, because it has this specific history, or in systemic science, this is what is called the path dependence. And so what I believe, and what this approach gives us the tools to really look at one particular phenomena from multiple perspectives. And this is really nice because we can look first at like the historical axis of the phenomenon. We can also look at the mechanistic axis, where we see, let's say, okay, so this system, this specific religious system, includes this ritual, and this ritual, for example, synchrony, uses these mechanisms, for example, neurophysiological mechanism, to achieve this and this effect. And then you can also look evolutionarily, which is why we have these mechanisms and how they evolved, and does it even make sense that they are adaptive, and so on. And you can start combining knowledge from these different axes or these different points of view, and see if it makes sense together. And I think this is really important because it's kind of cross-validation of your ideas across different perspectives. So it's not only that I claim something from this one perspective and ignore what the others are saying from different perspectives, but I actually try to bring those perspectives together and see if it fits or if one of them need to be, updated and, change the idea about the specific religious system. So in this respect, this is kind of like some people describe this as second wave consilience. So it's again some kind of attempt to bring multiple perspectives or synthesize multiple perspectives to generally increase our knowledge about a specific phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. So before we go, Dr. Lang, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Of course, this is a fabulous opportunity. So thank you all for listening. If you would be interested to hear more about my work, I'm pretty present across the social networks, so you can find me on Twitter. The handle is Martin Lang CZ. You can also look at my website, which is martinlang.cz, CZ like Czech. And you can also look at our university website, and I try to keep all of these resources active. So you can find all the papers I talked about there freely available.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Ricardo, for your interesting questions, and I hope the readers or listeners will enjoy our conversation. Bye-bye.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paula Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deja Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sunny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.